tribe of Judah. But he also at the same time belongs to the whole nation of Israel because, of course, these are the 12 children of Jacob. And so they're all related. And so David is related to all of Israel, but he is a member of the tribe of Judah, born in Bethlehem. And, it's interesting if you look at your maps, if you still have them, that at this time, Jerusalem actually is in Benjamin. It's not in Judah. But what's going to happen is Judah and Benjamin are going to become the two tribes that basically merge and become the modern Judah. Well, I shouldn't say modern Judah, but after the split between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, they become the 10 tribes and the 11 tribes. 10 tribes go north and the 2 tribes go south, or Judah and Benjamin. And I think also when you look at your map, that the same thing kind of takes place with, I think there's 2 here. So this is kind of, there's 2 there, should be. And so you look at that, you kind of see that Simeon, which sits in the middle of Judah, actually gets assimilated too. So when the Assyrians come in 722 BC and conquer the northern kingdoms, they conquer down to Benjamin, and then that part stays until the Babylonians come and conquer the southern kingdom. And so basically a lot of the tribes, when the northern kingdom was besieged by the Assyrians, actually came south. So there were a number of people from these tribes like Manasseh and Ephraim and Zebulun that actually came south to get away from the Assyrians. But for the most part, the southern kingdom is considered to be Benjamin and Judah. But I think Simeon obviously was also incorporated in that situation as well. It's interesting when you, as we're going to look at this, if I can figure out where my other map is, if you... When these tribes get together here, as we're going to see, and it'll say that Dan to Beersheba was a typical response you're going to read in the Bible. And Dan to Beersheba simply meant Dan was the northernmost kingdom, Beersheba was the southernmost kingdom. And so when they'd say Dan to Beersheba, or when you read that in the Bible or anytime see it, it means the whole nation of Israel, all the way from north to the south. Well, it's interesting here because what they're going to say is that this kingdom is all the way from, I can't remember exactly what the words were, but I think it's Hamath or Hamath to someplace in Egypt, and I can't remember. So the kingdom, as David begins to take it over right now, runs north of Damascus. So where Hamath is located, it's 120 miles north of Damascus. So now what David is saying, my kingdom runs from north of Damascus all the way down to the border of Egypt. So, when we look back at the story of Genesis, and God lays out the boundary of Israel, it goes to what's the big river? Euphrates. It goes all the way to the Euphrates River on the northern part of the region. So that's how much the kingdom once was. And so at this time, it actually grows back to where God had prophesied that Israel would be. It stretches out that far. And so this is the golden age, basically, of Israel. Questions? It's probably more information than you needed or wanted, but by golly, you got it anyway. So anything else that you see on this first part where David is now being to be crowned the king of Israel?
What kind of covenant did he make with them?
I don't remember reading anything about him specifically making a covenant, but God made a covenant with David. That
in verse 3 it says this, where King David made with them a covenant before the Lord, and they anointed him king over Israel.
Well, I guess you're right. So verse 3 you said?
Yes.
Huh. Mine doesn't say that.
Your translation doesn't.
But yours does, so it's got to be. It says what? What's this?
It says King David made a league with them.
That would just simply be a league, would be a covenant.
Oh.
So it's the same thing, yeah. It's kind of like you have the major leagues. They bring them together. They make a pact that they will be a united league. So you have these, whatever number of teams are part of the league. And so David is making a covenant. So all these 12 tribes of Israel will be in league with one another. They're a covenant. But mine doesn't say that. Doesn't say either of those things. But that's what happens. So David makes a covenant that he'll be a faithful king and they'll be a faithful people. That's basically what it is. When God makes a covenant with them, God will say, okay, I'm going to give you this like he did with Abraham. He makes a covenant with Abraham, makes a covenant with Moses, makes a covenant with David. He'll say, this is what I'm going to do for you, and this is what I want you to do for me. That's the covenant. If you're faithful to what I'm telling you to do, I'll be faithful to what I'm going to do. And so that's basically what a covenant is here. David is saying, okay, you're going to pledge me king. Okay, if you give me loyalty, you do what I, blah, 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 whatever those things would be, then I will be faithful to you if you're faithful to me, basically, and that's the covenant. Bob?
In regards to that, is that also going to be will there be a covenant with Solomon also with the people of Israel, or is that just a given in the process here?
Well, it'd be given from the standpoint of David anoints him, and so it's his predecessor in that sense. But God does make a covenant with Solomon. When God says, what do you want? And Solomon says, well, I just want wisdom and know how to run your people. And God says, because you asked for that, I'm going to do all of this for you. And that's his covenant with Moses. But again, it comes down, with Solomon. But again, it comes down to what David says to Solomon. If you are faithful to your covenant, God will do these things. But if you're not, then God will take the land from you. So that's always been an interesting piece of discussion through world history. God makes eternal or everlasting covenants with Israel about land. And yet at the same time, there's always that part that says, but if you're not faithful. And so today we have that big discussion. Well, Israel wasn't faithful, so, Israel really doesn't belong to them. But the Bible is pretty certain on a number of times that God makes an everlasting covenant with Israel because he never denies his people. He may bring judgment upon them, he may bring disaster upon them, but he never forsakes them. They are his people. And so if they're his people, their land is their land. And so again, we have that contention going on the world stage today, and people laying up on both sides of the aisle on that. But I've always, it's repeated so many times in Scripture that it's an everlasting covenant between God and Israel. And so I would have a hard time saying, as many times as Israel dropped the ball and God punished them, he never let them stay. Look at all the world, all the nations that have disappeared from the face of the earth. Not Israel, because God has watched over them and protected them. So that's a different story, a different political position, but that's not our lesson today. Yes?
Isn't there a scripture that says that God can sanctify a nation in a day, so he can shake them up so they will be sanctified, right?
Oh, yes, and you get into must be about, I would say, the 9th, 10th, and 11th chapters of Romans, and Paul says God's not done with Israel. He's saying that God's going to one day open their eyes and their ears once again, and they'll turn to God. So, we're into the New Testament, and Paul is saying God has not rejected his people. And one day, but of course it's the remnant. It's not like all of Israel is going to be saved because there's still going to be judgment. But the remnant will be saved. Israel will be saved. And Paul is absolutely, of course it is Saul. He becomes Paul. And so he's absolutely convinced that God will restore Israel. And, I think that if you talk to some of the more conservative Jews, you would find that they believe that one of the greatest miracles God has done in the 20th century was the restoring of Israel to its land. Because the reality is, you talk to these people, and I have, they never believed that Israel would come back to Israel. And that God would open that avenue, and how it happened is there to them an absolute miracle that God brought them back to their land. And not only to bring them back to the land, I mean, they're the strongest land in the Middle East, one of the strongest nations in the world. And you can't tell me God's hand isn't in all of this. And I mean, you look at how Israel, and again I'm getting off subject here, but you look how Israel in 6 days defeated 4 armies twice the size, more than twice the size of them. Took all of them together and beat them. And not just once, but 3 times. It's hard for me to believe that Israel is not still under the graces of God. So, back to the lesson, anything? Okay. Somehow I lost my, here we go, page 5, and not on 6 yet. So, okay. So now we move on. David has been anointed the king of Israel, and here we go. The king has been marched to Jerusalem, attacked the Jebusites, and lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They thought David could not get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. On that day, David had said, "Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say, the blind and lame will not enter the palace." David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built the area around it from the terraces inward. And he became more and more powerful because the Lord Almighty was with him. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Now it's interesting because if you read through Israel's history, Jerusalem actually had been conquered by the Jews. But for some reason, they evidently didn't drive out the Jebusites at that time and, lost the area. Because this is in the middle of Judah. Well, actually, like I said, it would actually be Benjamin at the time. And so anyway, they now are going to reconquer an area that they had conquered earlier. They conquered it way back under the time of Joshua. So here we go. And this, if you've ever been to Jerusalem, Jerusalem sits on protected by hills. In fact, they think that, whether it's true or not, I guess I don't have any reason to deny it, that, the Temple Mount sits on Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah, of course, is where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. And so that's the center of Israel. That's where the Wailing Wall is. That's where the Dome of the Rock sits today. That's Mount Moriah. That's where the Temple Mount was before it was destroyed by the Romans. And so anyway, David comes in, and I don't know what I was, lost my train of thought there quickly, but so anyway, David comes in and he takes back this land and this place in Jerusalem that the Jebusites have had. Jerusalem is when the Jebusites had it, it was only like 12 acres of land. It's really a small little area. In fact, if you go to Israel today, the city of David doesn't sit in the wall. So you have the wall of old Jerusalem, and outside of the wall sits the city of David. It sits below it. And so it's just a small area that you can go and see this whole area now. But initially it was the first part of the wall was built around the city of David. And then Solomon begins to expand the city of Jerusalem, and it grows. And then once again, when it comes under the time of, who's the crazy king? Who's king when Jesus is crucified? What's his name? Come on, everybody knows him. Herod. So when Herod comes, he begins to continue to expand the city. And so the walls get moved out and out. And so Jerusalem just keeps growing and growing. And then, of course, the big thing that he does is he rebuilds the temple. It's not a new temple. There's only two temples. There's the temple of Solomon and the temple of Zerubbabel. Those are the only two temples. But he rebuilds the temple of Zerubbabel. He basically tears it down and then rebuilds it into this magnificent temple that was there at the time of Jesus. The interesting thing is, they spent, 40, 50 years building this temple. And when they almost had finished it, the Romans destroyed it. So they never even brought it to a completion when they were rebuilding the temple the second time, or in this time. But anyway, another matter that isn't there. So another interesting thing as we get back to the story here. Anybody have any questions before? It always works better with questions than me, rather, actually, questions you haven't asked. But an interesting thing here is, David comes in and they're saying, you can't get in this city, you're just, there's no way you can get in here and conquer us. And David knows that there is a water shaft that runs into the city of Jerusalem. How he knows this, I suppose he has soldiers go and advance, reconnaissance or something. But anyway, if you go to Israel today, where the city of David is, there are two shafts. There is what they call today the Canaanite shaft or the Warren shaft, which is what he's talking about here. The Canaanites, years before Israel ever came, built a water shaft that runs into the city of Jerusalem, or Salem. It was at that time was called Salem. And they built this water shaft. And today when you go to Israel, there's two water shafts. Because if you read about the story of Hezekiah, just when the Babylonians, after the Syrians had defeated the northern kingdom, then the Babylonians come into power and they defeat the Syrians. And then the Babylonians come down and they surround the city of Jerusalem and begin, to move to want to conquer Jerusalem. And so what Hezekiah does is he builds a water temple or a water cave that runs all the way from the Gihon River into Jerusalem. And it's probably about, a couple of football fields long. But it's interesting because he had, and I think I'd shared this with you before, he has a number of his army go out to the Gihon River and start cutting into the mountain going one direction, and then he has people from Jerusalem cutting going in the other direction. This is 3,000 years ago. And somehow or other they meet in the middle. But interesting, when you go through this cave or this tunnel, it goes like from 4 feet high to 20 feet high. And it goes like this. But it actually meets in the middle. And you have a sign that they cut. It's still there. When Hezekiah's army went through this, or whoever the people were, that says at the end of it, it explains that they had built this tunnel, a water tunnel, so that they would be able to survive the besiege or the siege of the Babylonian army. But you can still walk through that tunnel today, and it's still filled with water. The Gihon River still flows into it, and it's absolutely smooth. The rocks are absolutely smooth as the water has continually gone over it. And it's not slippery. And I've gone through it, 3 times, I suppose. And it's just an amazing thing to walk through this water tunnel. Next to it is the Canaanite tunnel. It's a dry tunnel. It wasn't dry in the time of David. And so you can actually walk through the Canaanite tunnel. I've done that too, but that's not nearly as exciting. But you can actually walk. That's a lighted tunnel. The Canaanite tunnel is a dark tunnel. You have to actually have flashlights or something to go through it. But, it's really a cool experience, except you have to make sure you watch your head, because when he hits those 4 foot high things, I get a few knots when I do these things. But I remember one of the times we went through, and we would turn off the flashlights and stuff, and we'd walk, and it was just cool walking through. The water would start out like maybe at a half a foot deep, and then suddenly it'd be up to your thighs, and the water would change, and also in the time of the season it would make a difference too. But I remember going through this, and we were going through, and we were coming almost to the end, and you could see the light at the end of the tunnel, as they say. And all of a sudden, there's this lady screaming, trying, no, no, go back. I don't want it to end yet. She was having such a great time. She did not want to leave that tunnel. But when you walk through Hezekiah's tunnel and you come out on the other end, there is the Siloam, what is that? Silas. Huh? Yeah, the Pool of Siloam is right there. So you walk out of the Hezekiah tunnel, and there's the Pool of Siloam. And, they've continued to excavate that area, too, because part of it is in Palestine and part of it is in Israel. But there it is, where Jesus does the healing. And so, again, these are things that when you go to Israel, you can actually see that are biblical, that are there. And it's the lower level, because, of course, these cities keep building on top of each other. But you're now on the lower level where Jesus walked. And so you're actually walking on a sidewalk where Jesus walked to go to the Pool of Siloam. So it's pretty cool stuff. So anyway, that's where this is. We had a little history background on the city of Jerusalem and the city of David. And so again, it's interesting today that the city of David is not within the walls of Jerusalem. It's outside of them. But there's still a lot of excavation that goes on. And so again, part of the city of David is actually in Palestine, and the rest is in Jerusalem. Questions? And so anyway, David conquers this city, and then there's that little phrasing that comes out of there that it says, and that's what they say about the blind and lame. In other words, it prompted the phrase that proclaimed the Proverbs that it refused entrance into the city of David to aid David's enemies or to Jerusalem's enemies and undesirables. That's what they use that phraseology for, that the lame and the blind. It became a common thing for keeping people coming into Jerusalem that were unwanteds in that sense.
Also on that is the blind and the lame were not to go onto the court.
Right.
And so that was even followed up over the years.
Yeah, you couldn't, that's, it was, that was the really kind of a sad part about Israel is, if you had any kind of, blindness, lameness, you had leprosy or any skin disease, because all skin diseases were leprosy. I mean, they simply, if you had a skin disease, it was called leprosy. And so no matter how serious it was, you were, excommunicated basically from so much in Israel. And, can you imagine having some form of skin disease, leprosy, and you had to walk on the other side of the street and yell out, unclean, unclean, so you wouldn't contaminate anybody. I mean, it was just a horrible life. You could never go into, the sanctuaries. You could never go into the temple. You could go, into, sometimes, depending on the city, they would allow you to sit in the back, behind a screen. But otherwise, you were basically ostracized. You had to wear torn clothes and stuff, so you were recognizable. It was a horrible life, that's just the reality of these things. And so, anyway, that's another story that for. The other thing is that the city is actually, it says in Chronicles, it says the city was actually conquered not by David, but by Joab. And because Joab conquers the city, David makes him the king of his military, all the military, not just Judah. He becomes the king of the general of the army of Israel. And that's the reward he gets because he's the one who actually conquers the city of David. And so if you read that, you can read that in Chronicles 11 something or other. It talks about that. And so when we get in this section, when we're not going to go into Chronicles. We're gonna go to Kings because, of course, as you know, Kings and Chronicles are similar to books. I mean, the same stories are written in both of them. So what we're going to do is when we get from 2 Samuel through Kings, we're just going to, Chris and I will just add the stuff that's in Chronicles so that, if there's something significant, and there are things that they say, like this was not mentioned here, that Joab was a real conqueror and that David makes him the general over all of Israel, because he's the one who goes in and conquers the city of David. So there's lots of little insights that go on that are missing in some of these things. But again, in Kings you talk about all of the kings of Israel and Judah. And in Chronicles you're only talking about the kings of Judah basically, or when they interact with the kings of Israel. And so, we're just going to basically try to bring the two books together, do a challenge, and then we'll go from there. We'll go into Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. So, okay. Anything?
In Leviticus, chapter 21, verses 18 through 20, it says this: "No man who has any defect may approach, no man who is blind, lame, disfigured, disformed, no one who has broken a foot or hand, or who is a hunchback or dwarf, or who has an eye defect, a festering rash, scabs, or crushed. No descendant of the priesthood can officiate the offerings." And it goes on to explain a little bit more about Moses. Moses told this to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelites. So it goes all the way back to the time of Moses.
Yeah.
In a way, we're not allowed to.
Yeah. Yeah, it was and that's why they were relegated to being beggars, because, they were really restricted to anything they could do. There's only one temple in Israel, but except, of course, I should say that when the nation got divided and you had the Samaritans, they built their own another temple, which ultimately, the Maccabees destroyed. But there were lots of synagogues. If you had 20 men, didn't matter how many women you had, but if you had 20 men, you could have a synagogue. But women didn't count. So, that's just how it was. So wherever you had 20 men in Israel, you could have a synagogue. And so synagogues would allow sometimes people who had some kind of defect to be in the back behind a screen, but could not really participate. But yet, so they would have some sense of being where worship took place. But it was really restrictive in how people, but they were never allowed into the temple. So they couldn't go to worship in the temple. And so it was really a difficult situation. So you can see why people would huddle down at the pool of Siloam, and why they would do these things and hope for healing is because life was just, absolutely miserable for people with some kind of ailment like this. Okay, no questions? Let us move on. After he had left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These were the names of the children born to him there: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Samuel, Ibar, Elisha, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Elidiah, and Eliphalet. I probably had half one of those right. So again, David, you would think, and I realize there were not a whole lot of, Torahs floating around. It wasn't like today where everybody has a Bible or 10, 15 Bibles. But you would think that, the priest would be reading these things to David all the time. And it's interesting because in 1 Samuel 13, that was when God said to David, "This is a man after my own heart." He never says it again. And you wonder if things like this kind of prompted, those kind of situations. Because David's going to have the worst situation with family you've ever imagined. His wives and children are going to cause him, real problems. And, you wonder if it's because, he should know that, if you go back to Genesis, that the regulation on marriage, but he just, and he's not nearly as bad as Solomon. Solomon gets really carried away. But the reality is that what David's going to learn here is that all these wives and children are going to cause him nothing but heartache. And as we continue to read these stories and we see what happens, within his own family, there's rape, there's murder, there's just, and usurping even David himself, his sons, Absalom. So it's really a tragic situation. The other thing I find that's kind of interesting here is Nathan and Solomon are listed in here, and they're the two children of Bathsheba. And I don't know if this is true or not, but if you read through the genealogies of Luke and Matthew, they're different. And people have said that one is the lineage of Joseph and the other is the lineage of Mary. These two children of Bathsheba, people have said that Nathan is the progeny or of the generation of Mary, and that Solomon is the generation of Joseph. And so that's why there's a difference in the people who are on the two accounts. Whether that's true or not, I think it's kind of interesting, because these are the two children of Bathsheba and David, are Solomon and Nathan. So take that for whatever it's worth. But again, if you go into Chronicles 3, they talk about Nathan being the son of Bathsheba and David. But again, we find that if Deuteronomy 17 talks about the marriage restrictions and things that David is openly defying here. So, questions? Anything you see in this situation here? Yes?
Who was the mother of Solomon?
Bathsheba.
Okay, and Nathan also?
And Nathan also. Those two are the only two of Bathsheba. They lost the first son. And then these were the two sons that came after that.
You said the lineage of Joseph came from Nathan?
Mary. Joseph is Solomon. This is what, again, these are things that are speculative. They were trying to say how this fits in, because you have such a different genealogy in both Luke and Matthew. Totally different names. And so, but that they would come from basically the same genealogy, tree. Then they said, well, that's because Joseph came from Solomon and Mary came from Nathan, who are both of the lineage of David. So that's how, whether that's true or not, those are just things I've read. And I thought, well, I'll just confuse you a little bit more and throw out some more information for you to be confused about. Questions?
David's first wife was the one that was,
First wife was Michael.
yeah, so
Yeah.
he should have just stayed with her and just not.
Yeah.
Her to another man.
Well, that was not that was not her choice that she would go to another man. It was David had rejected her, basically. I don't know we don't really know. He just never seemed to be really interested in her. It was kind of like, that was how he got in the good side of Saul. Saul said, I want you to marry my daughter. Go ahead and give me 200 foreskins, or 100, actually it was 100 foreskins. He gave him 200. Then I'll give you my daughter. It was never like a love situation that Michael was in love with David, and I think he did not treat her well. I mean, she helps him escape. He doesn't even come back to try to get her. He doesn't even come to try to contact her. He goes and gets the rest of his family. Doesn't do anything with Michael. And so then eventually she probably feels neglected, and so she marries, I can't remember his name, starts with a P, I think. And she marries this guy, and he loves her. He's nuts about her. And of course, when David decides that he's going to, require Ishabosh to send back his Michael to him, her then husband, crawls basically all the way back to to David in Hebron, crying because David's taken away his wife. And then, they just say, go back home, get out of here. But she's basically lonely from that time on, I think. And you'll see as we get into the story how her and David are not, love made in heaven. Match made in heaven. But, the other part of that, as you get to the end of the story, she doesn't get children. And whether God was, in a sense, did something in that situation, or they never had sex. And of course, she had this other husband, but she never has children. So that's the end of the lineage of Saul, or at least the royal image of Saul ends because, she never has children. And again, it's, these often times we say, what happens if Saul, had been, like Eli, who gave in to the fact or accepted the fact of the punishment. What happens if Saul had done that and kept David as his general? How would that war have ended that got him killed if David were there with his army fighting with him? You don't know those kinds of things, but the reality is there's consequences for our actions, always. You never escape consequences in your life. And David experiences that as well. Even though he's a man after God's own heart, there are great consequences that he experiences. Okay, let us move on. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up full in force to search for him. For David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out of the valley of the Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands?" The Lord answered him, "Go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines in your hands." So David went to Mount Perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, "As waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me." So that place was called Baal Perazim. And Baal Perazim, Baal means Lord, and so Baal Perazim means the Lord of the breakthrough or the Lord of the breaches. And David honors God by naming that after him, so to speak. And so there we have. So this is the first battle. The Philistines realize that what's going on right now is that they don't want this whole of Israel to be united. And so they decide now is the time to attack them before they really get organized. And so the Philistines come against David with all their force, and they attack them in the Valley of the Rephaim. And the Valley of the Rephaim was named after the Nephilim. Remember the Nephilim in Genesis? The Nephilim were the monsters, or the giants. The Nephilim were the giants. And they named this valley after that. So they're actually going into that valley, which is about 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And we've gone. Israel's not very big. 120 miles, 125 miles north to south, 75 miles across. That's Israel. And so there it was a little bit bigger than it is now, but it still was not a very big place. And so when you see these things like the Philistines are probably only about 50 miles. If you look at your maps that you have there. And so the Philistines were in this area of Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Askelon, and Gaza. That's where the Philistines are. And you can see how close they are to Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And so, as you're going to see here, this battle that's going to take place is probably 20, 25 miles apart. That's going to take place at this time here in this story. And so, again, this, it's just not a very big area that this stuff is going on. And so they go to battle, and again, the thing to note here is the first thing David does is he consults God. Deal one, I'm going to go to God and check out what God wants me to do. God says go. So this is important because David doesn't always use this wisdom, but in this case he does. Bob, are you going to say something?
Well, I think that it's interesting that David has now realized that God is with him in previous scriptures as well. And now he's taking the opportunity to check in with the Lord. I don't know if it says anything about his priesthood in regards to the Year of Thummim, but it just gives a real credence that if we learn to listen to the Lord instead of assuming we're going to go do something. Yeah, we can go attack the enemy, but God has a plan how to attack the enemy.
Absolutely. Yeah, good. Yeah. and you're going to see that in the next, because they're going to have the same battle, but it's going to be a different battle plan. God has different plans each time. You can't take things for granted. You can't, presume on God. You just, and I think David does that. The next is that he begins to presume on God. Well, obviously, I'm God's king. I can do what I want to do. God will honor me, and boom, it doesn't happen quite like he thinks. But so David defeats the Philistines here in this first battle. Again, kind of a side note, but it's kind of, when you talk about these battleground places, like Mount Perazim here, where the plain of Elam is, or the field of Elam? You know what that is in the Bible? Okay, that's where David defeated Goliath, in the field of Elam. And you go to Elam, you go to this place in Israel, and they have, on one side is a mountain, a lower mountain, because there are lots of hills and mountains. And on one side is where the Philistines were, and then the other side, the other mountain, is where Saul and the Israelites were. And in the middle is the valley of Elam. And you can go in the valley of Elam. And so we were in the valley of Elam one day, and I thought, you know what? There's the stream right there in the valley of Elam that David took. So I went and took 5 small, smooth stones from, I don't know, I'm probably going to be in trouble if anybody hears a stream from Israel. They'll probably be arrested by stealing 5 stones from but I did anyway. But I took 5 small, smooth stones from the river in Elam, or the stream in Elam. But you can go to, it's just kind of cool, you go to these places that you read in the Bible, and they're really there, and you really can go out and see, yeah, it's a big open valley where David came down from one side and Goliath from the other side, and they met in this valley. So anyway, another side light thing. Yes?
When you're there, do you actually feel like, oh, I want what Jesus was to, is there, okay. Is it just, or does that make sense?
Now, people do experience, different things. I mean, there are times when you do feel really close to God. And, it's just how it struck me, our bus pulls up, and I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, what is this? Just a big open field, And then he says, and this is the field of Elam. And my God, that just hit me, because I just suddenly remembered, well, this is where David fought Goliath. And so it's kind of, you get little chills. But yeah, there was a lady, and she was describing what her experience in Israel was like. And she said, knowing the Bible well, it was like, having a black and white picture of the world. And being there was kind of like suddenly somebody colored it. And now everything was in color and was just different. And that's really true. Things really do come to life. And there's so many places like that. And so, it's a trip of a lifetime. It just simply is, because, you experience all these things that you're reading about. It's really cool. And, once my wife she went the first time without me. Not because I had to convince her to go, because she was terrified of going to Israel at the time, because they were still having a lot of situations. In fact, when we went the first time together, the Palestinians, the Palestinians in Gaza had just attacked Israel on Saturday with 500 missiles, and we were leaving on Monday morning. And everybody was saying, you better stay home. And I said, no, we're going. So that kind of stuff. And one of the times we were over there was one of the times that Israel attacked the Syrians. And they just did a, big, jet plane bombing of Syria at that time. And the interesting thing was, I never even knew what happened until a couple of days later when I read about it in the newspaper. Even though Israel's not that big, if you're not real close to something, you don't know what's going on. But we never, they're really good about security over there. I mean, they want to protect you. So early in the morning, at night, before you go out and get on a bus, they've already, is there going to be a protest? If there's going to be a protest, you're not going to go there. You're going to go somewhere else. So there was never a time we ever worried about things like that, because the security is really good. And all of this, even, the Palestinians don't carry big arms. They only have small arms. It's Israel that's a security force over all this stuff. Israel's a security force at the Dome of the Rock. The Muslims have the governance of it, but Israel is a security force. It's a lot better, people hate the wall idea, and you have all these signs about the wall needs to come down to Israel. It's protected them, because they used to get car bombings and bus bombings all the time. They rarely do have that stuff happening now. Although, when you have these things going on like they are right now, you have stuff like that happening. But yeah, we never felt in any way, threatened or insecure. Same thing when we went to Egypt. Even though in Egypt, your guides are armed. That was kind of interesting. But we never felt afraid. And again, they really watch over you and protect you. I remember, I shouldn't keep getting off track here, but we were in Egypt and we were in Cairo, and we were walking down into the marketplace. And they have huge marketplaces, tons and tons of stores. And we were walking this marketplace. And of course, I'm kind of drifty. And I started just kind of drifting off, not even realizing it. And all of a sudden, this guy in a plain clothes comes up and he puts his arm around me. He says, "Let's walk over here." Well, he was actually a policeman, and he had been watching us. And, we found out you always had a guard with you, a policeman with you, but you also had a lot of other plainclothes people who were always watching you as well. And we found that out in a few times when somebody would come over and kind of direct us back to where we should be doing. So it was never a sense that I felt, insecure or afraid, and neither did anybody that went with us. Although the nice thing about it, if you want to have something that's nice about it, we never had a line anywhere. And there used to have like 2 or 3 hour lines to get into the tombs, into the Valley of the Kings. There wasn't anybody there. We could walk into any one of the tombs that was open, because there's like the Valley of the Kings. There's like 70 tombs, and then they will have like 10 open at a time, and then they'll rotate them around. But yeah, and they're amazing. They're absolutely amazing. And we just walked in and spent as much time as we wanted there. We're never in a rush for crowds, never saw crowds. And that was true of all of the time. Now, Israel was different. Israel is packed with people. The only thing they have in common is beggars. I shouldn't say call them beggars, I guess, but people who just harass you everywhere you go. You come out of some holy site, and there you run into a bunch of people who are selling you pencils and calendars and whatever you might buy. And so my wife would say, "Why don't you buy all of them from me?" They look like they need the money. All right. Okay, let's keep going here. So they defeated Israel, or they defeated the Philistines, and now the Philistines decide once more they're going to come against them. So once more the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. As David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, "Do not go straight up, but circle around and behind them and attack them in front of the poplar trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching of troops in the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean that David has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army." So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. And again, as Bob said, each situation is different. You can't presume on God. This time God says, we're going to do this different. And you'll know when I'm moving, because when you hear the sound of the wind and the poplar trees, that's my army. The angels going before me, and they'll lead the way. And so David obeys, and that's what happens. And so there's, and here it says that the Philistines abandoned their idols, and then David and his men carried them off. Just as you remember back in the story when Samuel, how they would take the Ark of the Covenant and then go into battle because they believed that God was going before them, and then of course they lost the Ark to the Philistines. Well, that's kind of what's going on here too. The Philistines take their idols and they go into battle. And because they believe their idols, their gods, are greater than Israel's God. And so, But once they go into battle and get defeated, they just leave their idols behind because they realize Israel's God is greater than their God. And so it says that they pick up their idols and they carry them off. And at first when I read that, that kind of troubled me because, that's kind of like, what are they doing carrying off these idols? But again, see, this is why if you go into Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 14, you realize that what they did is they took these idols and burned them. But it doesn't tell you here, but it tells you in Chronicles. And so that's, again, when you have these, comparable stories, you see that some of these things happen. So what they did with those idols, they burned them. They didn't keep them. Unlike when you had the story back of Rachel and Jacob, where she takes Laban's, his idols from his house, and she carries them and she keeps them. That's not going on here. They're not keeping these idols. They're burning them. So, okay, any questions you have on chapter 5? Yes?
I was just wondering if the tourism in Israel is low now because of all the goings on in the Middle East.
Is what? I missed something there.
Tourism in Israel, if it's gone down because of all the stuff going on in the Middle East.
I'm missing that word there.
Tourism, tourists.
Oh, tourism. Oh, I kept hearing jurism, like jurists. Lawyers. What the lawyers got to do with this? I don't know right now. It was for a while. There were people stranded in Israel for a while. But I'm assuming it's getting better. I know we always went with this one organization, and that's who we always worked through. And I noticed that they were sending me stuff again, that they're doing tours again. So I would guess if they are, so is everybody else. I don't know about the big ship lines because, that's what happens is these great big, ships come in, these cruise things, and those people will just flood a city in a quick hurry because thousands of people on those cruise ships, and they get in 10, 15 buses and they go into a site. Well, that's going to back up everything. So I don't know if it's that if that's going on in that extent. But I know the cruise or the tours are back open in Israel, and so. But I'm sure they're down. I'm sure if you want to go right now, it'd be a good time to go. But like I said, we went a couple of times and there was stuff going on, and it just, I just never felt insecure about that. And I would go now. My wife would go every day if she could. She just loves Israel. But when we stopped doing the tours when I retired, we just haven't, thought about. We talk about it that we're going to start touring, just the two of us, start going and doing things, and she'd like to go back. And it's all different. I mean, because you read about now, all the problems with tourism all over Europe and in these areas, and they're starting to charge you excessive monies just to go there, more for your hotel room, taxes on everything. And that was never there. We've been, to London, to Dublin, we've been to, Rome, we've been to Athens and Istanbul. We never, had things like that. It was always, and we were always treated well. People talk about, bad, crowds treat tourism badly. We never experienced any of that stuff. I don't know what it's like now. You read about it being much more. But plane rides were not like they are now either. You read about all this stuff that's going on within passengers on planes. It just never was like that. I used to tell the guide was Jewish, there's a guy that owned this tour company. And I always said, why don't we fly, what's the Jewish airline? They have their own airline. Gosh, I can't think what it is now. But I always said to him, I said, why don't we ever fly that? And he said, you've been on an airplane with Jews before, haven't you? Now, this guy's Jewish. And I said, yeah. And he said, what do? They'll congregate in groups to do their prayers all the time. And they'll run right over you. They don't care if you're in their way. They're going to do their thing. And they'll take every open space there is. He said, can you imagine what it's like if you were on a Jewish airplane? said, all right, we'll just keep flying. But, I'm telling you, they'll just knock you down. If you're standing in the aisle and they're going somewhere to do their prayers, they'll just knock you over. But, yeah, it's interesting. Okay, chapter 6. Here we go. And so, again, David's going to learn something really important here, and that is what we've been talking about. He's going to learn that you can't assume, you can't presume on God, that indeed you need to first, turn to God first, seek God's will and God's way, or you're going to run into problems. And so that's where we're going to be here. And the Ark of the Covenant, remember, was made 400 years earlier. So the Ark is 400 years old. Moses, had the Ark made 400 years before David. And so that's what we are here, as David is going to attempt to bring the Ark to Israel. So David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Bela in Judah to bring up from there the Ark of God, which he called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim and the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Eo, son of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it. And Eo was walking in front of it. David and all of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, labyrinth, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark because the oxen had stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there before the ark of God. So here is the first tragedy that David seems to experience as he's trying to move the ark, and this happens to them, that a man dies because of David's not thinking. Again, David gets angry at God, as we're going to see here. But the issue is the fact that he doesn't follow instructions. God tells him clearly what they have to do to move that ark, how you move it. And they just think they're going to do a good thing. They're going to do a brand new, clean, cart that's never been used, put it on there, and we'll transport it, be fine. But that's not how God instructed them to do it. In other words, it had to be Levites. They had to carry it by poles. Everything was laid out on how it has to be done. And if you're not going to follow the instructions, it isn't that God is mean or unjust. It's that God is holy. And God has to act in a manner consistent with who he is. If he sets rules, he's got to follow his own rules. God can never act contrary to who he is. If he's holy, he has to act holy. And sometimes we just don't think about that. We get upset because God does something according to who he is, and he has to act according to who he is, his own person. And we get angry, and realize it's because we didn't listen. And we face the consequences of our own, stupidness. Yes?
Well, the cart did come up through the Philistines on a cart.
Yep.
And so they probably assumed that if it came up that way, everything's kosher. And not really taking the time to go back to Leviticus and see how things are supposed to be done. There's a say like a world standard versus God's standard.
Yeah. And you're right, but the Philistines weren't Jews. And so God, didn't treat them the same as he was treating the Jews. And the other thing here is, in my looking at this stuff, the house of Abinadab, his sons were Levites or priests, probably priests. So they should know. They should know this. But they don't. And as a result, Abinadab loses his son, and David becomes angry as they do this. Because, of course, you can't touch the ark. You can't touch that which is sacred to God. Questions? Yes?
Would it have been easier, faster to put it on cart?
You know,
I'm picturing how
You know, considering the terrain, I'm not sure how much faster it would be in a cart, but maybe, because you have, a couple of mules or a couple of donkeys pulling it. But there was a length of the poles had to be a certain length. They had Levites, a certain number of Levites had to be carrying it. And when you have a procession, it doesn't matter if you have donkeys leading a procession or you have people, because you only go as fast as the people who are leading it. And so there's a lot of people walking. And so it probably wouldn't have been any faster on a cart because they had to be within this procession. And so this procession is really large. And so it's only going to move at the pace of whoever's leading this procession, which is probably David on a horse. Or in Israel, king only rode a horse in wartime. Otherwise, he rode a donkey. So David might even be on a donkey. In fact, when Samuel becomes king, he rides David's donkey. And then if you come back to the story of, Jesus, and he rides on a donkey, if the people have any recognition at all, that's how David came to Israel on a donkey. That's how Solomon comes to kingship, on a donkey. And so here's David fulfilling, scripture from Zechariah, and he comes on a donkey. But of course, they're looking for the king on a horse, because they want a conquering king to defeat the Romans. And of course, again, that's just the reality, the consequence then you suffer for presuming on God. Okay, questions on anything else?
That's where Jesus comes back on the horse as the king.
Yeah, when you read Revelation, yeah, he's on a horse. Big white horse. Big white horse. Absolutely. Good. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah. And to this day, that place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom and the Gittite for 3 months. And the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Now, King David was told, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God." So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and fattened a calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sounds of trumpets. And so, again, in 1 Chronicles 15, it says that David commanded the priests to do it the right way. So it doesn't say it here, but again, that's why it's nice to have the comparatives. But if you went to 1 Chronicles 15, it's going to tell you that David told the priests, let's do it the right way this time. So maybe, again, he inferred first of God. We don't know. It doesn't say that either. But anyway, he did it the right way this time. And they get the Levites to carry it, put it on poles of the right length, and do everything right. And this time, the celebration is even greater than it was the last time as they come in. In fact, David is so exuberant that he basically takes off all of his kingly garb and puts on just a linen ephod, which evidently was kind of like not wearing much clothing, which of course is going to upset his wife. And he's dancing with all he's worth as he leads the ark back to Jerusalem. Questions? And again, in this story, as I can't remember where I read somewhere that the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, he was a Levite from the tribe of Kohath. And so again, it goes to a house of a Levite. So somebody who should have, otherwise there might have been more problems with God in this situation. But again, they see that God blesses this family. And so once again, David's hope is restored, and he does it the right way. And so the ark is brought to Jerusalem. Anything else you see? Any questions? Okay. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. When she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in the place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of the Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their homes. So David comes in, and he's all excited, and he's dancing like crazy. And Michal sees him, and she's displeased with what she's seeing. And of course, again, Paltiel, her husband, is one of the reasons she's upset. She might also be upset not only because of what she's seeing in David, but remember, David, she's a daughter of Saul. And she's experienced Saul dying. She's experienced her other three sons killed in battle, or other three brothers, and then her last brother, who was king, killed. And through all this, David survives, and I'm sure there's probably some animosity towards that too. Why wasn't David there? He was the general. Why wasn't he protecting her father and her brothers? And wasn't Jonathan his best friend? And so I'm sure there's all these things are probably part of what's going on. I mean, I don't know, but and so in her heart, she has no joy for David whatsoever. Questions?
Not a good thing that David did that dance? I mean, he's not supposed to do that?
I don't know that he would. I suppose it's, in her mind, as a king, he should act a little more kingly, not take off all his clothes and dancing, in front of all the people. I mean, so, I think that's kind of one of the things she's upset about. But whether that's the only thing she's upset about, I don't know.
Nobody had done that before. It's not like a thing.
Yeah, nobody's ever done that before. In her mind, it's not a good thing. In David's mind, and everybody else doesn't have a problem with it, but she, for whatever reason, hasn't. Bob?
One of the things that I see here, and I'm not sure exactly how it all relates, but I see David becoming a priest in this aspect of worship. The ephod was a part of the priest's uniform. And so he was worshiping the Lord in a new way in that regard. He was a king, and now he's presenting himself as a priest of worship.
I can see that. I don't know if that's acceptable. But we do know who is prophet, priest, and king. Jesus. So Jesus is the prophet, priest, and king. But he's the only prophet, priest, and king. Whether or not God would have had a problem with David acting priestly, I don't know. But he doesn't seem to do anything about it here, if that's the case. If that's what David was trying to do, as could be true. I don't know. But yeah, ephod is what the priest would wear. But there were unique ephods that priests wore that were different. They had a priestly ephod, and high priest had a different ephod than, say, the Levites or the other priests. There were. So again, I don't know for sure. You can research that. You go on the internet and find out all sorts of things. Yes.
But it's like, okay, if you take Trump and he did something like that, the people are all going to be like, oh my God. If somebody did that, and the people in that generation are all going, how embarrassing.
It was certainly to Michal. It doesn't seem that anybody else seemed to have a problem with it, except for her. And, so I don't know. And again, we're looking at a time 3,000 years ago when, culture was so much different and things were different. And that's one of the problems we have, is trying to take our time and put it into their time. We do that so often. Even as far as back as, George Washington, we find all these sins this is what life was like, 160 years ago. That was normal. And we can't suddenly put our normal on other people's normal. We need to understand those civilizations. And this is how life was. And yes, in our times we can look back and say, why, they treated women really horribly. I mean, but that was the culture. That's how it was all over the world. Women had, almost zero rights, not just in Israel, but in all the cultures. One of the reasons there, Paul spoke out against homosexuality was it was common for some of these cultures like the Greeks and the Romans, for the aristocratic people to have, boys for sexual relations. And they would marry women to have children. But otherwise, women weren't considered on the same par as men. And so they would have sexual relations with men. And particularly, a lot of the emperors would have, young boys as, they would marry them. But they'd always have a wife because they needed children. And wives were there. So, I mean, when you go back into those times, that culture was so much different. It was crazy. But you can't go back and say, well, put our culture into that culture. Then the good news is we've gotten better. We still got ways to go, but we've gotten better. But you can't judge something else by your standards. And that's what we do today. So we become revisionist history people. We want to rewrite history. Well, you can't. You have to accept the fact that's who people were. It's just like slavery, It was, if you weren't free, you were a slave. That's how it was. If you weren't Jew, you were a Gentile. If you weren't Romans, you're a heathen. Slavery was common. I can't remember, I think one time it was like 70% of the world was slaves. That was a common thing. And so, people say, well, why didn't Jesus do something? That's not what Jesus came for. But the point of it is, if we become Christians, what's going to happen to slavery? It's going to disappear. If we become like Christ and we treat, no slave, no free, no women, no men, no Jew, no Gentile, we're all one in Christ. If we treated everybody like that, there's no more slavery. There's no more hatred, animosity. But people don't see it that way, because they become narrow-minded and, it's wrong. And, but anyway, that's a new political issue I don't want to deal with right now because we got to get done with our lesson here so we can get out of here. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house. And when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel, I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. And there it is, the end of the story. Questions? I got to quit because it's 11:30. No, go ahead.
Did she have children before that?
No, no, she never had children. Yeah. The royal line of Saul ended with her. There might have been other, we don't know, nephews and nieces hiding around, but as far as the royal family, she was the end of it.
Her resentment might have been part of too, that she was in love with this and married to this other guy. I don't remember his name. But
Paul Thiel.
David took her away, and she was in a loving relationship. It made it sound, anyways. And so she harbored that resentment in that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, the other part was she loved David at one time, and he just really never treated her very well, like I said. And so she has lots of reason, and David only brought her back because he wanted to prove a point, which was he wanted to show people that remember he's of the royal family of Saul. Remember, he's a son-in-law. And so he wants to have her there because it verifies who he is as, the king of Israel. So he only brings her back to satisfy his own kingly position. Not because he cares about her, loves her, and she knows that. And so, all these things are part of this. It adds up to how her animosity that she feels towards David. So, yeah. Anything else? Well, hope you learned something today. Well, let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, again, we just thank you and praise you, Lord, for this time we could spend together. And again, we just thank you for your presence. For, Lord, we know you never leave us, you never forsake us. You're always as close as our next prayer, never more than a breath away, Lord. And we come to honor you. Lord, you honor us because that's the kind of God you are. And so again, Lord, we thank you for this time, and now we just ask you once again to watch over us, to bless us and our families. Once again, Lord, that all the prayers have been raised to you today, Lord, would meet fruition as you would reach down and touch each and every one of those people, Lord, and bless them richly in your love and grace. And again, Lord, bless this church, this staff, and Lord, just watch over each and every one. And again, watch over your church universal. Lord, we know this world is in chaos. We know there's all these goofiness and things that are going on, all the hatred that's out there. But Lord, we know that you are in control and that one day all things will work out to your praise and glory. Help us walk in your light by that lamp, that, Lord, we always may walk the straight and narrow. We ask this all in Christ's precious name. Amen. Thank you, everybody.